The morning moved with practiced ease inside the Greenlease estate. Sunlight filtered through trimmed hedges and wide windows that never faced the street. Wealth announced itself quietly here, in polished floors and schedules that ran on time. Nothing rushed, nothing threatened. The world beyond the gates felt theoretical. The boy woke when he always did. Shoes laid out, uniform pressed, hair brushed by hands that had done it 1,000 times before. Breakfast waited, untouched by noise or urgency. He ate quickly, not because he was late, but because routine asked him to. Childhood here meant predictability dressed as comfort. Outside, the car idled at the end of the drive. The driver leaned against the door, familiar enough to blend into the landscape of safety. He had driven this route countless mornings, knew the guards, the turns, the shortcuts. Trust did not need explanation. It existed as inheritance, passed down with property and privilege. The boy climbed into the back seat without looking up. He buckled himself in, backpack heavy against his knees, eyes already drifting toward the window. He watched the gates open, slow and ceremonial, then close behind them. It felt like departure without risk, movement without consequence. Inside the house, no one noticed the exact moment the car disappeared. That absence would matter later. For now, the morning continued as designed. Phones rang, coffee cooled. The day claimed its shape. As the car rolled forward, the driver glanced at the mirror, checking nothing in particular. The boy hummed softly, unaware of how closely his life was tied to this narrow stretch of road. The estate fell away, replaced by familiar streets, predictable turns. Nothing suggested deviation. Safety here was intentional. It had been built, paid for, rehearsed. Guards at gates, names on lists, faces memorized. The Greenlease name carried weight that smoothed obstacles before they formed. Danger belonged to other places, other families, other stories. The boy shifted in his seat, thinking about school, about a test he had forgotten to study for. His worries were small, contained. He did not imagine fear. He had not been taught to. The car slowed near an intersection, sunlight flashing across the windshield. The driver adjusted his grip on the wheel. Ahead, the road offered choices so ordinary they barely registered, left or right. Seconds passed without ceremony. Inside the back seat, the boy leaned forward slightly, still humming, still safe in the only way he understood. The gates were far behind them now, closed and confident. What came next would begin quietly, without force or warning, disguised as another morning behaving exactly as it always had. No one marked the moment as dangerous, because danger had not announced itself yet. It never does. It waits inside familiarity, wearing routine like a uniform, borrowing trust as camouflage. By the time anyone thought to ask where the car had gone, the answer would already be moving further away, quiet, deliberate, and irreversible, before dawn fully lifted the illusion of safety forever. The road unfolded in the same orderly sequence it always had, and that was why no one noticed the detour. The car moved past the usual turn, rolled through a light it normally avoided, and continued without urgency. Nothing abrupt marked the change. The driver's posture stayed relaxed. The boy remained quiet, watching storefronts slide by like scenery he had seen before. Minutes accumulated. At school, the first bell rang. Teachers marked attendance without concern. Children arrived late for reasons that rarely mattered. The absence did not yet have weight. Inside the estate, the morning tasks ended and attention shifted outward. A phone call was placed, casual at first, to confirm arrival. It rang, then rang again. The silence that followed felt temporary, easily explained by traffic or distraction. Trust filled the gap where worry might have formed. The driver took another turn, unfamiliar but plausible. The boy noticed the change and leaned forward. "Are we going a different way?" he asked, voice thin with curiosity rather than fear. The answer came quickly, gentle, practiced. "Construction," the driver said. "Won't take long." The boy settled back, reassured by tone alone. Time stretched. The car did not arrive. The second bell rang. A secretary frowned at the empty space on a clipboard. Another call was made, less casual now. It went unanswered. The absence gained edges. At the estate, routine began to fray. Someone checked the driveway, as if the car might still be there. Someone else checked a watch, then checked it again. The gates stood open to nothing. The name Greenlease, usually a guarantee, failed to produce answers. On the road, the city changed character. Streets narrowed. The driver's voice fell silent. The boy watched unfamiliar buildings pass and felt something shift, a discomfort he could not name. He pressed his hands together, waiting for the return of something recognizable. Back home, the first question was asked aloud. Not what happened, but where are they? The distinction mattered. Violence had not entered the story yet. There was no shattered glass, no struggle, no witness pointing and shouting. There was only time, expanding. Phones multiplied, voices lowered. Each explanation sounded reasonable, until it didn't. Traffic, a flat tire, a missed turn. Every possibility delayed the one no one wanted to name. At school, administrators began retracing steps. The familiar driver had not checked in. No substitute car appeared. The absence hardened into fact. The secretary's pen paused midair. The boy felt the car slow. He looked toward the window, then at the driver's face, which no longer offered reassurance. He did not speak. Silence filled the space between them, thick and instructive. Back at the estate, panic arrived quietly. It entered through questions and schedules and unanswered calls. It did not shout. It waited, patient, letting uncertainty do the work. When the realization finally surfaced, it carried no clear image of harm, only the unbearable truth that a morning had gone wrong without anyone seeing how. By the time the word disappeared was spoken, it felt premature and inevitable at once. The house held its breath. Outside the gates, the city moved on. Somewhere between turns and time, a child had slipped out of the story of safety, leaving only a widening silence that demanded to be filled. That silence would soon invite searchlights, questions, and men who specialize in finding what was missing. But for now, it lingered unanswered, shaping the hours ahead. The detour, unnoticed at first, had become a corridor with only one direction, pulling everyone toward a reckoning none could yet imagine before the night arrived. The silence did not last. It learned to speak. The call came in the early afternoon, after panic had exhausted itself into procedure. Phones were arranged on tables, numbers written down, voices coached into calm. When the receiver lifted, the voice on the other end sounded composed, almost courteous, as if calling about a business appointment that had slipped the calendar. There was no shouting, no threats, only conditions. The man spoke slowly, choosing words that left little room for misunderstanding. He confirmed the boy's name, his school, the color of the car. Proof arrived not through cruelty, but accuracy. "We have him," the voice said, and the phrase landed with a weight that bent the room inward. Instructions followed. Do not contact police. Do not alert media. Prepare money. The amount was stated plainly, without flourish, as if it had been calculated long before the call was placed. A time was given, a second call promised. Then the line went dead. No one spoke for several seconds. The house, once echoing with motion, held a stunned stillness. The words ransom and demand felt foreign, imported from another world where families like theirs were headlines, not participants. Hope shifted shape. It no longer lived in rescue fantasies or sudden returns. It narrowed into compliance. If the rules were followed, if the instructions were honored, the boy would come home. That belief became the new anchor, fragile but necessary. Money, once abstract, turned physical. Bank officers were summoned. Accounts were unlocked. The numbers were vast enough to inspire confidence, and small enough to feel suddenly insufficient. Wealth, long assumed to be protection, revealed its other face. It could buy time perhaps, but not certainty. The second call arrived precisely when promised. A different voice this time, but the same careful tone. Corrections were issued, clarifications made. The family was reminded, politely, that deviation would have consequences. There was no need to describe them. Imagination supplied the rest. Negotiation crept in quietly. Could the amount be adjusted? Could proof of life be offered? Each question was met with measured pauses, then answers stripped of emotion. The boy, they were told, was fine. He was eating. He was quiet. Details offered sparingly, like favors. Between calls, the family rehearsed obedience. They learned to listen for cues, to read between syllables. The kidnapper's language became a system, one that rewarded precision and punished improvisation. Every word mattered. Silence, too. Outside the estate, authorities circled at a distance, present but unnamed. Their involvement existed in shadows, carefully managed, a risk weighed against desperation. The family was forced to choose between rules imposed by criminals and faith in institutions that moved too slowly for a child measured in minutes. As evening approached, the weight of compliance pressed harder. The boy's absence filled rooms, sat at tables, stared back from photographs that now felt accusatory. The voices on the phone had become the only bridge, thin and trembling, between before and after. When the final call of the day came, it carried a shift in tone, subtle but unmistakable. Instructions grew more specific, locations hinted at but not named. The process was moving forward, the voice assured them, provided everything remained orderly. Orderly, the word echoed long after the call ended. Order was what had been stolen first, before the boy, before the morning itself. Now it was being sold back, piece by piece, at a price that rose with every heartbeat. As night settled in, preparations continued under dim lights and quieter voices. The family clung to the rules as if they were promises. Somewhere, unseen, the boy waited within a story now written in numbers and instructions. And with the next call, the language of Ransom would demand more than money. It would ask for trust in the darkest terms possible. By dawn, every decision would tighten the trap, pulling them closer to choices ahead. The night did not bring relief. It brought procedure. By morning, voices arrived that did not belong to family or kidnappers. They wore suits and restraint, introduced themselves with credentials, and asked for chairs rather than answers. Investigators spoke softly, promising order where panic had lived, mapping timelines, listing calls, drawing boxes around chaos. Their presence changed the house. Rooms became stations. Phones were labeled. Notes were copied twice. Hope adjusted again, learning to stand beside caution. The family was told that compliance could be managed, that listening did not mean surrender. The word strategy replaced pleading. The kidnappers, when they called, sounded unsurprised. They corrected details the investigators had barely finished assembling. Times were precise, routes anticipated. It felt rehearsed, as if the crime had been practiced without witnesses. Professionalism draped itself over menace, tidy and calm. The men advising the family spoke in similar tones. They warned against improvisation, against trust that ran too fast. They explained patterns, past cases, the habits of disciplined crews. Each explanation steadied nerves and planted seeds of doubt. If this was a pattern, then someone had learned it. If someone had learned it, then someone had taught it. Instructions arrived again. A drop was proposed, then postponed. A test was suggested, then withdrawn. The kidnappers monitored reactions, the investigators said, measuring obedience like a pulse. The family learned to perform calm, to answer with restraint, to let silence do its work. Yet the professionalism cut both ways. The more orderly the voices became, the harder it was to imagine mercy. There were no slips, no anger, no desperation leaking through the line. The absence of emotion suggested control, and control suggested a willingness to wait. Suspicion, once aimed outward, began to drift inward. Investigators asked who knew routines, who had access, who benefited from predictability. Questions hovered over drivers and schedules, and doors left unlocked. The familiar began to look porous. Trust thinned. A distant relative was mentioned, then dismissed. A staff member's name was noted, then circled. No accusation landed, but gravity shifted. The crime no longer felt like an invasion from nowhere. It felt like a design that fit the house too well. Another call came near dusk. The voice acknowledged delays, accepted them, adjusted terms. It spoke like a manager solving a problem. When asked about the boy, it offered a brief confirmation and nothing more. Professional courtesy replaced reassurance. After the call, one investigator lingered by the window. He watched the gates and said little. Finally, he noted that disciplined crimes often end in two ways: resolution or escalation. Both require patience, both punish mistakes. As night returned, plans tightened. Money was prepared with ritual care. Routes were rehearsed without committing to memory. The family was told to sleep, though sleep felt like betrayal. Somewhere, men who sounded professional waited for compliance to prove its value. What no one said aloud was that professionalism also meant detachment, and detachment, once proven, could make the next instruction far more dangerous than the last. The investigators cautioned that patience could fracture under pressure, that disciplined men still erred when watched. They advised recording every call, mirroring tones, conceding nothing unnecessary. The family practiced answers like lines, careful not to sound rehearsed. Outside, cars idled without lights, presence without promise. Inside, clocks grew louder. With each minute, professionalism tightened the grip, and the house learned a new fear, that control itself might be the weapon, shaping the next step toward a meeting no one could yet see. This understanding settled heavily, preparing everyone for a transition from waiting to movement. The next instruction, they sensed, would not be a call alone, but a demand to act, to leave the safety of rooms, and enter a place where professionalism would test obedience. By dawn, the case would shift from voices to footsteps, and suspicion would demand names in the coming hours ahead. By morning, movement replaced waiting. The house learned that money, once invisible, had weight. It bent conversations, rearranged loyalties, and pulled strangers closer than friends. Wealth, the investigators said, explained motive, but it also complicated mercy. It made the family valuable and resented in equal measure. Questions turned sharper. Who knew the accounts? Who talked too freely about numbers? The investigators spoke of class resentment, of crimes fueled less by need than by entitlement. Someone, somewhere, believed the Greenlease fortune was not only accessible, but deserved. The family felt exposed. Their generosity was audited alongside their security. Past donations were mentioned, then contrasted with guarded gates and private drivers. Had protection replaced presence? Had routine replaced vigilance? Guilt surfaced quietly, without accusation, settling into the pauses between questions. Money moved again. Cash was counted, wrapped, weighed. The amount felt obscene when stacked, fragile when imagined as the price of a child's breath. The investigators warned that wealth could provoke escalation. It promised reward, but also invited cruelty from those who felt owed. Resentments emerged in subtle ways. A former employee's grievance was recalled. A contractor's unpaid dispute resurfaced. Each memory arrived with a sting, a reminder that privilege left impressions even when kindness was intended. The family wondered how many smiles had concealed anger. Inside the house, fractures deepened. One voice urged full compliance, another cautioned restraint. Decisions about money became judgments about love. If they paid quickly, were they saving their son or encouraging harm? If they delayed, were they protecting him or themselves? The investigators acknowledged the burden. Rich families, they said, were taught to solve problems with resources. Kidnappers understood this instinct and exploited it. Wealth trained obedience as effectively as fear. The language of ransom relied on both. Another call arrived, brief and precise. The voice adjusted the amount slightly, citing inconvenience. The change felt like punishment, subtle but deliberate. The family complied, because refusal felt unthinkable. Money proved its power by disappearing without protest. Afterward, silence pressed harder than before. The boy's absence now carried a number, a valuation that clung to every thought. Photographs on the walls felt transactional, as if memory itself had been priced. One investigator spoke privately, his tone less procedural. He asked whether the family had considered that money might not guarantee return. The question landed like an accusation, though none was intended. Wealth could buy access, not outcomes. As night approached, preparations shifted from counting to movement. Routes were planned with care, avoiding patterns, avoiding witnesses. The family understood that their riches had drawn this threat close, and now demanded risk in return. In the quiet, guilt sharpened into resolve. Whatever their failures, they would not let money be the final measure of love. Yet they also knew it was the only language the kidnappers answered. The next instruction, when it came, would ask them to carry their wealth into the open, to test whether privilege could survive the dark places it had summoned. That reckoning waited just ahead. Outside the estate, activity increased without announcement. Cars repositioned, radios whispered. The investigators warned that the exchange, when ordered, would compress time into minutes. Mistakes would be irreversible. Wealth would offer no shield once movement began. The family listened, absorbing the final lesson money had to teach. It could summon help, invite hatred, and purchase attention, but it could not stand in their place. When the call finally came, it would not ask who they were, only what they would do. And so they waited, counting not bills but breaths, knowing the next chapter of the ordeal would demand action beyond calculation, carrying their fortune toward a location still unnamed, where value, loyalty, and fear would collide. That collision would set the terms of survival, forcing every promise, suspicion, and ounce of wealth into motion at once. Nothing after would feel theoretical again, for anyone involved, from that point onward.
Darkness came and went without names. The boy learned time by sounds, a door opening, footsteps, the hum of a distant engine. He sat on a blanket that smelled unfamiliar, knees pulled in, hands folded because there was nowhere else to put them. When a man spoke, it was softly, as if softness could be exchanged for safety. He was told rules: sit here, drink when offered, ask nothing. The voice praised him for listening. Kindness arrived in pieces, measured and conditional, and it confused him more than shouting would have. He wondered if being good could make the morning return. They called him by name, which made them feel close. One man brought food and asked about school, about games, about whether he liked dogs. The questions felt like gifts, but each answer tightened the room. Information moved outward, control moved in. He tried to remember the drive, the turn that felt wrong, the way the car slowed. Memory slipped. Fear filled the gaps. When the man left, the boys stared at the wall and practiced not crying. Tears felt dangerous, like alarms. Sometimes another voice argued quietly beyond the door. Sometimes laughter leaked through, brief and sharp. The boy learned the rhythm of presence and absence, how silence could mean rest or threat. He slept in short bursts, waking to check that he still existed. Promises appeared and vanished. Soon, they said, after a call, after money. The words money and call floated like passwords he did not have. He wondered if he was a problem to be solved, an errand unfinished. A woman arrived once, unseen but heard, telling him he was brave. She used the word like a blanket, tucking it around him before leaving again. He held on to it because it was all that stayed. When he asked to go home, the man sighed, tired, and said home was waiting. The answer hurt because it sounded true. Hope pressed against fear until both ached. The room smelled of oil and dust. A window showed only sky. He counted clouds to make minutes. He counted breaths to make hours. Each count ended where it began. At night, he imagined his name traveling through wires, reaching rooms he knew. He imagined his mother's voice saying it carefully, like glass. The thought steadied him, then broke him again. Once the man crouched and said none of this was his fault. The boy nodded, though fault had not occurred to him. He wondered what fault looked like, and whether it were a face he recognized. The door opened less often. Voices grew tighter, instructions repeated. The boy sensed movement elsewhere, decisions stacking like boxes. He felt himself being carried inside those plans without touching the ground. When the light changed, when footsteps hurried, fear sharpened. He understood that waiting was ending. Something was about to happen, and it would not ask his permission. He folded his hands and listened, small and exact, as the next sound promised a crossing he could not see. Outside, engines idled, radios murmured, plans tightened. The boy felt the air change before the door opened again. A voice rehearsed calm, told him to stand, to follow, to trust. Trust felt heavy now, but it was all he had. As he rose, he imagined footsteps converging, money changing hands, adults deciding futures in measured tones. He did not know where he was going, only that movement meant choice had been made elsewhere. He stepped forward anyway, carrying his name like a signal, while unseen clocks synchronized. Whatever waited beyond the threshold would turn waiting into action, and action into consequence. It would also pull families, investigators, and men who sounded professional toward the same point, where voices would meet faces, and the price of every decision would finally be counted in the open, before night fell again, and the next order arrived without warning tonight.
Movement replaced waiting before dawn, as if the night had been rehearsing this moment. Cars shifted positions without headlights. Radios murmured codes that sounded like weather. The family was told again that precision mattered more than speed, that calm was a tool, not a feeling. The plan was simple because complexity invited error. One driver, one route, one stop. The money sealed, marked, heavy with expectation. The instructions were repeated until they lost meaning, becoming shapes rather than sentences. At the edge of the city, the handoff point emerged from darkness like a thought no one wanted to finish. An empty lot, a single light. No witnesses by design. The driver's hand shook once, then steadied. Phones stayed silent until they did not. A call came, brief and exact, confirming location, correcting posture, reminding consequences. The voice asked if the child was valued. The answer was yes, spoken without breath. The driver stepped out. The air felt staged. Money was placed where instructed, then the driver returned to the car. Time stretched thin. Every second became a decision already made. From the shadows, movement answered movement. A figure approached, cautious, professional, face obscured. There was no greeting, only confirmation. A nod. The exchange existed in gestures, not trust. The mistake was small, a footstep too quick, a glance held too long. Human reflex colliding with choreography. In that fracture, the quiet broke. Engines started where none should have been. Shouts followed, sharp and uncontrolled. The figure fled without the money. The driver froze, then moved as trained. Radios erupted. The plan collapsed into motion, irreversible and loud. Sirens cut the night open. Investigators revealed themselves, weapons lowered but present. The empty lot filled with meaning it had been chosen to avoid. Somewhere else, a child was being moved. In the aftermath, explanations arrived too late to matter. The family learned that compliance could still provoke escape, that professionalism adapted quickly. The exchange had changed everything without completing anything. Hours blurred into coordination and regret. Questions circled the smallest detail, replaying the misstep until it grew monstrous. Guilt attached itself to everyone, because blame required proximity, and they had all been close. The kidnappers called again before dawn. Anger sharpened into efficiency. Terms changed, locations shifted. The voice blamed interference without naming it. Proof of life was promised later, like a concession. Inside the house, sleep failed. Decisions hardened.
Investigators spoke of escalation, of compressed timelines, of children becoming leverage when plans unravel. The family listened, stunned by how fast hope could be redesigned. Somewhere in motion, the boy felt the change. Hands hurried, voices sharpened. Waiting ended and fear took shape. He was moved again, carrying silence like instruction, unaware that one mistake had rewritten the rules. By sunrise, the case no longer belonged to planning. It belonged to consequence. The exchange that should have closed the story had opened it instead, demanding answers that would arrive too late. Maps were redrawn, trust lines erased. Every previous assumption was questioned under fluorescent lights. The city felt suddenly smaller, every road a possible corridor, every delay an invitation to harm. The investigators warned that the kidnappers would test limits now, probing for weakness created by interruption. Control had been challenged. Response would follow. The family braced for a call that would not negotiate. Outside, news hovered without headlines, rumor without confirmation. The world sensed movement but not direction. Inside, clocks were ignored. The next instruction would set a harsher rhythm. For the boy, movement continued without explanation. Vehicles changed, voices changed. The promise of soon dissolved. Waiting returned, altered by urgency, as if time itself had learned fear. The family prepared for the worst kind of clarity, the kind delivered by strangers with updates. The exchange had failed. What followed would be faster, darker, and far less controlled. As the day advanced, resolve replaced bargaining. Investigators shifted posture, plans turned aggressive. Somewhere between calls and movement, innocence became the only thing no one could negotiate back. That truth settled heavily, guiding every step toward a confrontation still forming. The next chapter would ask whether speed could undo damage already set in motion. Nothing now would return the moment before the mistake.
Morning arrived without announcement, and with it came the call no one had prepared to receive. The voice on the line was not the kidnappers this time, but an investigator's, stripped of caution. Coordinates were given, then a pause, then words that shifted the case from movement to stillness. Rescue was no longer the goal. Search teams moved because stopping would have been unbearable. Sirens stayed distant, respectful, as if sound itself could bruise the moment. When they reached the place described, the ground told the story before anyone spoke. Recovery replaced hope with procedure. The family was brought later, after the worst had been contained by distance and language. They were told facts in measured tones, each sentence a step away from denial. The boy was found. He was no longer waiting. Grief did not arrive as sound, but as collapse. From that hour forward, the investigation hardened. Timelines tightened. Voices sharpened. What had been negotiation became reconstruction. Every call was replayed. Every delay weighed. The question shifted from how to save him to how this had been allowed. News traveled faster than compassion. Headlines arrived stripped of restraint, turning grief into spectacle. Public sympathy cooled, replaced by anger that searched for targets. Wealth, secrecy, and hesitation were recast as complicity. The family felt judged by strangers who knew only outcomes. Investigators followed the money's shadow and the voices that guided it. Patterns emerged, then names. Men who sounded professional were revealed as practiced criminals, their control frayed by interruption. Accountability began to take shape, cold and procedural. The boy's name was spoken carefully now, as if volume could disturb what remained. His room stayed untouched, a museum of ordinary mornings. Innocence became the unpayable cost, carried by everyone who had touched the case. As arrests loomed, statements were prepared and defenses imagined. Justice began its slow assembly, indifferent to sorrow. The case would move from fields to courtrooms, where truth would be argued rather than found. Those closest to the process felt the shift immediately. Meetings became evidence reviews. Compassion was replaced by precision. The purpose was no longer to persuade kidnappers, but to withstand scrutiny. Every decision made under fear was now examined under light. Inside the family, grief fractured into private forms. Guilt argued with memory. Love searched for places to land. They learned that survival did not mean escape, only continuation. Outside, outrage demanded speed and certainty. Commentators reduced complexity to verdicts. The story hardened into a lesson others could consume without cost, while those inside it paid forever. Search warrants multiplied, confessions recorded, then cornered. The professionalism that once masked brutality dissolved under pressure. Truth emerged not as revelation, but as accumulation. By nightfall, the case stood on the threshold of judgment. Names would soon be spoken publicly. Justice, delayed and damaged, prepared to enter the room. Nothing could return the morning that had begun behind gates and trust. The cost of being rich, of being careful, of being human, echoed through every report. What remained was a record of choices and a child reduced to evidence. Prosecutors prepared narratives that would compete with grief. Defense teams gathered explanations. The next phase would ask a different question, not whether he could be saved, but who would answer for the loss.
The investigation's center of gravity shifted from roads to records. Phones, receipts, and routines formed a portrait of intent. As the community braced for court, the meaning of justice narrowed, demanding names, dates, and sentences. Hope did not disappear, it changed address. It moved into the belief that truth, once fixed, could prevent repetition. That belief would be tested next, under oath. The chapter closed with paperwork and prayers, with evidence bags and empty rooms. Tomorrow would open in a courtroom, where stories hardened into verdicts, and mercy was measured by law alone. Nothing would feel simple again, for anyone involved here afterward.
When the suspects were finally named, the reveal disappointed those waiting for monsters. They were men with ordinary histories, uneven jobs, familiar resentments. Interviews unfolded under fluorescent lights, not drama. Grievance spoke first, rehearsed and thin, blaming luck, class, and a system that owed them something they never earned. Greed followed, quieter but heavier. Money was described as pressure, as inevitability, as proof of worth denied elsewhere. Each man framed himself as temporary participant, a helper, a driver, a planner who never meant harm. Responsibility was diluted by grammar, spread across pronouns and pauses. Under questioning, cracks appeared. One suspect fixated on procedure, repeating timelines until they unraveled. Another grew angry at implication, mistaking volume for innocence. A third retreated into silence, rocking slightly, eyes fixed on a point beyond the table. Psychological strain replaced bravado. Investigators listened, patient, letting contradictions accumulate. They asked about the boy only once, then again. Answers shifted, language softened. The word kid replaced asset. Rationalization faltered as consequences took shape. Recordings were played back. Voices that once sounded professional now trembled, stripped of control. The men heard themselves promise safety they could not deliver. One asked to stop the tape. Another stared, unmoving, as if punishment could be postponed by refusal. Explanations turned inward. Childhood slights were offered. Debts were recited. A sense of being unseen hardened into entitlement. They spoke of plans going wrong, of interference, of the exchange. None spoke of choice until pressed. When pressed, one admitted fear, not for the child, but for exposure. Another confessed to panic during movement, a moment that accelerated everything. The smallest decisions, they learned, carry the longest shadows. Charges were read. The words landed differently than threats had. The men listened as futures were enumerated in years. Their bodies responded first. Shallow breaths, clenched hands, averted eyes. Justification thinned into regret, too late to matter. Public reaction followed swiftly. Sympathy evaporated. The narrative shifted from why to how could you. Motive, once explanatory, proved insufficient. Grievance did not excuse outcome. Greed did not soften harm. In private rooms, investigators assembled timelines that refused mercy. Each step aligned with intent. Each pause suggested choice. The men were not monsters, but they were accountable. As proceedings advanced, defenses prepared stories meant to humanize without absolution. The court would hear about backgrounds, not excuses. The question ahead would not be who they were, but what the law would do with them. Outside, the family waited, learning that understanding perpetrators did not return the boy. Knowledge offered structure, not relief. Justice moved forward, indifferent to nuance, toward a reckoning measured in sentences. The chapter closed with paper signed and cuts applied. The men led away without spectacle. Their rationalizations remain on record, hollow. What followed would test whether punishment could satisfy loss, or merely mark it. The next phase would ask the court to weigh intent against impact, and decide what accountability looks like when motive is not enough. It would also ask whether understanding harm could coexist with condemnation, and whether stories told under oath could honor the child without turning grief into theater. Lawyers rehearse openings, reporters sharpened angles. Jurors would be chosen from lives untouched by this corridor choices. As calendars fill, the case thickened into precedent. Everyone prepared to speak carefully, knowing language could wound again. The courtroom would become the next site of collision, where motives would be weighed, but consequences would dominate. There, restraint would be tested, and judgment would take its formal shape. Sentencing loomed, quiet and inevitable, promising closure that no verdict could truly deliver for anyone involved here. When the trial opened, relief was expected, and did not arrive. The courtroom felt narrow, airless, crowded with history that refused to stay quiet. Wood benches held strangers who studied grief like evidence, searching faces for meaning they would never own. Proceedings moved with practiced efficiency. Dates replaced memories. Voices flattened emotion into record. Each witness carried a life reduced to sequence: before, during, after. Institutional failures appeared between lines, acknowledged without apology. The family sat together, separated from the public by posture alone. Their names were spoken formally, stripped of affection. Questions probed decisions made under fear, recasting survival as calculation. Every pause was interpreted, every choice weighed. Investigators testified next. They explained strategy, timing, restraint. They described professionalism and interruption,
plans that frayed under pressure. Cross-examination turned care into doubt, suggesting alternatives that existed only in hindsight. Responsibility blurred without disappearing. Experts followed. Psychologists spoke of rationalization and stress. Economists outlined ransom mechanics. Each explanation clarified process while emptying meaning. The boy appeared only through descriptions, his presence mediated by adults who never met him alive again. The defendants listened, sometimes impassive, sometimes folded inward. Their lawyers argued context without denying outcome. They spoke of intent fractured by panic, of men unprepared for consequence. The prosecution answered with timelines that refused mercy. Testimony stretched days into weeks. Jurors learned the weight of repetition. Photographs were referenced, not displayed. Silence carried more force than images. The courtroom absorbed sorrow without acknowledging it. Closing arguments promised clarity. They delivered precision instead. Guilt was defined, responsibility assigned. The language of law closed gaps emotion could not. When the verdicts were read, no one breathed easier. Sentences followed, measured and finite. Years were named, appeals outlined. The process concluded with order, not comfort. Justice stood complete on paper, untouched by grief. Outside, cameras waited for reaction. None felt appropriate. The family left quietly, carrying outcomes that did not resemble healing. Inside, the court prepared for another case, already erasing memory with routine. In the days after, commentary argued fairness and severity. The word closure appeared often, unsupported by experience. What remained was absence formalized, loss translated into precedent. Justice had been procedural, careful, correct. It had not restored innocence or softened consequence. It had only marked an ending that did not feel like one. As calendars turned, attention shifted elsewhere. For those inside the story, time stalled. The next chapter would ask what survives when the trial ends, and whether living forward can coexist with a verdict that resolves nothing essential. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving echoes to settle into corners where testimony had lived. Files were boxed, ropes hung still. For those who remained, silence felt louder than arguments. Grief resisted scheduling. It intruded during meals, during sleep, during the smallest routines that once felt safe. The family learned that verdicts organize facts, not feelings. They carried transcripts instead of answers, dates instead of comfort. Outside, life resumed with an efficiency that felt cruel. Traffic moved, schools opened, headlines rotated. Inside them, the trial replayed without permission, looping questions that no sentence could quiet. They wondered whether different choices could have bent outcomes, whether restraint had cost time, whether speed would have saved anything at all. These thoughts arrived uninvited and stayed. Counsel advised moving on. Friends suggested rest. Neither instruction addressed the weight that followed them home. Justice had spoken, but grief demanded a voice. That unresolved tension would travel forward, shaping memory, relationships, and the meaning of survival. The next chapter would live there, beyond courtrooms, where consequences continue without witnesses. Nothing ever truly ends after verdicts arrive.
Years passed, and the house learned new habits. Doors stayed unlocked, lights left on. The family moved through rooms that remembered everything, touching surfaces as if they might still be warm. Wealth continued to arrive on schedules it could not break, obedient and useless. The case settled into archives. Reporters called less often. Classrooms studied it briefly, then moved on. The boy's name became a paragraph, then a footnote, then a warning delivered in careful tones. History flattened what grief kept sharp. Anniversaries arrived without ceremony. Each year carried a different weight. Shock, anger, exhaustion, a quiet that felt earned and undeserved. The family learned how to answer questions without inviting them. They learned which memories could be shared and which demanded privacy. Money funded foundations, scholarships, fences pulled down and rebuilt elsewhere. None of it rearranged the night. None of it corrected the smallest mistake. Wealth could amplify intention, but it could not edit time. The lesson repeated itself until it felt permanent. The parents aged visibly, though they avoided mirrors. Their conversations changed. They spoke less about prevention and more about presence. They learned to sit with uncertainty rather than negotiate it away. Grief, unmanaged, had once demanded action. Now it asked for witness. The community remembered selectively. Some spoke of criminals and punishment. Others debated policy, strategy, response. Few spoke of the boy beyond his smile, preserved and simplified. Complexity made people uncomfortable. Simplicity traveled faster. In private, the family questioned the story they had inherited. They wondered whether safety had been outsourced to systems and schedules, whether trust had been confused with entitlement. whether innocence had been priced without anyone noticing. They understood now that money can summon attention and delay harm, but it cannot guarantee mercy. It can buy compliance, not outcomes. It can fund lessons learned too late. The house eventually changed hands. The gates were replaced. New routines formed without memory. Life continued, indifferent and necessary. The family carried a legacy quietly, aware that silence could be both refuge and burden. When asked what the case meant, they answered carefully. They spoke of vigilance and humility, of listening to risk rather than assuming protection. They avoided conclusions that felt neat. Over time, the family accepted that prevention stories often comfort audiences more than they protect children. Checklists and protocols create the illusion of control, a promise that attention can substitute for unpredictability. They learned that vigilance is human, not institutional, and that care cannot be delegated without cost. Conversations with other families revealed shared patterns: faith in systems, relief in routine, shock when both fail. These exchanges did not heal, but they connected losses across distance, building a quiet fellowship of listening rather than fixing. It taught them to value presence over assurances, and to treat safety as a practice renewed daily, never a purchase completed once, without shortcuts or guarantees. The story ends where it must, with a question that refuses resolution. Did the crime begin with greed, sharpened by opportunity and grievance? Or did it begin earlier, with the belief that innocence could be purchased, secured by wealth and procedure, protected by distance? The answer remains unsettled, living between choices and consequences. It survives in pauses, and habits changed, in a name spoken softly. Nothing that followed could buy it back.